And the price of me potentially having this thing with my name on it that could increase my discoverability with new readers, maybe accelerate my writing career, the price is for me to humble myself enough to be a student at a time in my life where I sometimes think I'm the master. I think it's good for all of us to get into that track every now and then. I mean, because certainly if I had gotten that deal with James Patterson back in the day, and we're talking like 2016, so this was a long time ago, I don't think I would have been ready for it. I don't think I would have succeeded because I would have been kind of arrogant about my approach, my process.
Hello, fellow creative Voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Kevin Tumlinson about writing pivots and the power of humility, including Kevin's journey of moving from a pantser to an outliner and the cognitive challenges he faced during the transition. Kevin speaks candidly about his existential crisis and burnout from overcommitting to activities outside writing, revealing how it affected his creative process, and about the importance of humility and continuous learning in a writing career. And now, let's hear from Kevin Tumlinson about writing pivots and the power of humility. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Kevin Tumlinson. Hey, Kevin, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
It's lovely to have you. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Kevin Tumlinson is the writer _, and I'm going to have a question about that in a moment. A best-selling and award-winning author, prolific podcast host, and in-demand public speaker. Kevin writes mostly thriller novels and Substack posts and enjoys a life of travel and exploration alongside his wife and their tiny dog. And so I had gotten your bio information and it said the writer _, and I thought it was like a wingding that had gone wrong, like a copyright symbol or a registered symbol or something. Then I heard you actually mention the writer _ somewhere else. So what's the story behind that?
So the short version of that story is when I went to name my Substack back a couple of years ago when I started it, I wanted something. I had claimed this title, the writer, in it because I'm very pretentious. But it didn't feel right. When I put it on screen, it just didn't quite have it. And then I put that _ to stand in for like a cursor. And believe me, if I could make that thing blink, I would make it blink. But what I've adapted a philosophy around it now, because what it stands in for is like, as a writer, there's that adage, you've heard this adage, that writers write and authors have written. And so I am an author and nothing's ever going to change that. But in order for me to continue being a writer, I have to be active. It has to be ongoing, right? And so the cursor stands in for that. It's a symbol of I'm continuing that process, that work. So
nice.
I'm the writer _ I'm the writer cursor. Blink, blink, blink.
I like that. And do you yourself say _? Is it like if you're Prince and now you're a symbol instead? Like we all want to say it the right way.
I say it every now and then just to call it out and hoping that people will ask me why, what it means. And if I'm discussing it, I call it out. But if it's just appearing, I now put that everywhere. Every now and then people ask me if that was intentional or if that was an accident or whatever. And I get to tell them the story. And then when I tell them the story, they're like, oh, wish I had thought of that. But you can't use that because it's mine.
That's cool marketing, to do something that encourages people to ask you about it and you can talk about it in a way that's brand right for you.
That's what I do, Matty. Cool marketing. That's what I'm all about. I'm even taking on, I don't know, you and I haven't talked since this has happened. We haven't publicly announced it yet, but the guys at BookBrush just invited me to be there. They're starting a new service. It's a standalone company that's provided by BookBrush. It's called Author Anchor. And they brought me on as their chief branding officer, CBO. So I'm going to be talking about that a lot in the coming months.
Nice.
That thing launches in about 8 days officially. So.
Oh, cool. So just to orient people, we're now in the middle of February. So I think by the time this is out, you will be underway with your new role. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a lovely group to work with too.
They are, yeah. And that thing is all about helping authors find virtual assistant VAs. And
cool.
So I've got a VA. It's been revolutionary for helping me so that I can just write. That's the whole thing, right? Like writers just want to write. What's your goal? Just write. So I get to hand off all the other stuff to a very inexpensive, frankly, VA, and then I get to just write. So anyway.
Well, if anyone is interested in that, I just interviewed Kate Tilton in episode 270, Author Assistance, Finding One or Being One. So if that topic intrigues anyone, I have a resource out them for them to check out regarding author assistance.
Thanks.
But we're here today to talk about crafty kind of things.
Yes.
And we had chatted about a possible topic, and we landed on a pantser's move to outlining.
Yeah.
And so I'm very interested in hearing what made you, as a committed pantser, move into this new approach to craft.
I'm going to say that ultimately it was J.D. Barker who forced me into a life of outlining. But and the way it came about was I do the Writers Inc. podcast with him and Christine Daigle and Jenna Brown. Early days of that, when we started doing it, I kind of asked him some questions about the process he has with James Patterson, the co-authors with James Patterson. And I was asking about the outlining process in particular, just how they handle it. And I kind of knew some of Patterson's method because I had done his masterclass back in the day. And I'd even pitched, because he had asked for people to pitch series ideas to him. And my pitch had gotten pretty far. It ultimately I didn't get to co-author with him. But so JD said, well, why don't we just do something together? And then I can show you kind of on the fly. And so we did. But it's funny because the first time I tried it with him, I fell apart. And it was a rough time for me anyway, Matty. Like, I was already having a bit of an existential crisis as a writer, as a person. And so I kind of fell apart on that. And then he came back around with a different idea. He had heard an interview I did with Ernest Dempsey on my show and about archaeological thrillers. He's like, I got an idea for one if you're interested. And that was more in my wheelhouse. And so I was able to kind of flex some of my existing muscle to help me with getting the outline done. And we ended up with a pretty remarkable outline. He actually told me it's the first time he's gotten an outline. He didn't have any notes or feedback. So I guess I did okay.
And how were you and JD dividing up the role? Like, were you coming up with a story idea and then outlining it and he would flesh it out, or vice versa? Or how did that work?
Yeah, so he had the initial idea, effectively a title and like a log line for what the story could be. And so he handed that to me and let me run wild with it. And I came up with a fleshed out outline of a well-developed story, frankly. And ideally, he would give feedback and notes. We'd change that, but he liked that outline. It was a very thorough outline. I probably overdid it.
How long was that outline?
I'm going to say it was like 16 pages of bullets of dozens of chapters, almost 100 chapters. So about 80 chapters, I think, is what I outlined on that. And it was pretty detailed because the story itself was very complex. So that maybe I just wore him down, and that's why he didn't have feedback. But no, he's pretty good about that kind of thing. He's worked with authors who've done that sort of thing before. So we had a pretty solid concept. So we started writing. The way we're divvying up the duties is I hand him what I've written, he gives me feedback, and then we go from there. But I'm effectively writing the whole book at the moment. I'm just writing the whole manuscript, and then I'll hand him what I've done. I handed him the first 4 chapters, and he had no serious notes, a few things. And then I'm just running with the rest of the book. So he'll get that, and then we'll modify it. But yeah, Jay, it's been interesting because I have stuck to that outline, but I'm also improvising in between the notes. So I think of myself like a jazz musician. Like I have the sheet music in front of me, but I'm free to improvise from note to note. And so there's a kind of hybrid pantser plotter approach happening there.
Yeah, I really like that analogy. And I'm someone who, after having written a book that I had to do a lot of ripping and tearing on because I'd written it all and then realized there was kind of a fundamental problem with it. And then I started doing what I call a frame rather than an outline. Sometimes frame is more comfortable for people. I have the whole nautical analogy going on with framing out a boat. And I think it's really important to get that perspective that doing the outline or doing the frame doesn't mean you're locked into it. And I really like the jazz analogy there.
Yeah, because some of the problems, I have problems with the whole plotting idea, and it's all me. But one of those is like, I don't want to be rigidly locked into anything. And I was never comfortable with that. People would always say, and JD said this, like, we just need the outline. You don't even have to stick to it. And I'm like, if we're not going to stick to it, then why am I doing it? So what I've done is take that bit of advice from him and kind of not really turn it on its ear or anything. I mean, this is not uncommon. I think this is what a lot of writers do. So I think in effect, what I've learned is to plot out the beats rather than the elements themselves, the events themselves, so that you are able to play in between those nodes. So in other words, like, I know chapter to chapter what the core action needs to be or what needs to come out of it. I think one thing that's helped me is to think in terms of the impact that the events of the chapter are going to have rather than the events themselves. So I know that at the end of chapter 15, I need everybody to be freaking out that there's a signal that's creating havoc with the animals on planet Earth. And so that's the sort of outcome. I think that's probably a good way to think about it and look at it. Is like, I'm not going to plot out exactly what happens in that chapter. I'm going to say, maybe I start with how it started and how it's going. And by the end of that plot point.
Yeah, I found with the book I'm working on now, there are usually in my books 2 storylines. There's a storyline that gets the protagonist involved early on while the bad guy's doing things that later on the protagonist will react to. But there's some point, like in this book, there was some point where I kept playing around with stuff at the beginning and playing around with stuff at the end. But there was a point in the middle where I had everybody assembled where I needed them to be. They're all assembled at a shuttered hospital. The good guys are mainly outside. The bad guys are mainly inside. And everybody was where they needed to be. And that was really useful to me because I could keep playing with stuff in the first part, knowing that the second part was sort of protected. It was like a little demilitarized zone where changes in either side weren't really going to impact the other one. And it just made it more manageable to know that there wasn't going to be probably a sweeping change that I was going to have to then go and implement through the entire book.
Yeah. 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 Because that's the thing. That's one of the things that I sort of dread is coming up with something in chapter 20 that means I have to go back and rewrite most of the previous 19 chapters. Typically do that when I'm pantsing. I don't know why. When I come now, because the story evolves as I go, I guess I just don't have those moments. But anytime I've ever tried outlining, I always inevitably come up against like, oh, I wish I had done this a little different. So
yeah. Well, I just had the example again in the book I'm working on now, where my version of framing is that like the first pass will be the protagonist allies assemble outside the shuttered hospital and share plans on what to do. Like that's my first. And then the second pass is they assemble and one of them decides to go back to Philadelphia to get something. And then the next pass is after the one that goes back to Philadelphia leaves, the other 2 have a conversation about something. So I'm just sweeping through and beefing it up a little bit. And I'm trying to hold off doing the dialogue and the description as long as possible, because if it turns out that I don't need a scene where they're outside the hospital talking about things, then I haven't wasted all that time. But I did have the situation where I got to the end of, this is going to be like a 90,000 word book. I probably have 55,000 words. I've beefed it up to that level. And I got to the end and I was like, you know what? I currently have the bad guys have 2 henchmen, and it would really be better if they had 3 henchmen. And if I had already gone through and written all the dialogue and done all the description and all that, and now I had to go back and shoehorn in a 3rd henchman, that would be a lot more painful than being able to go and just update those more sketchy versions with that improvement.
So something I've always done in my books is I sort of adapted this from comic book writing, which I didn't do, but for some reason, I am connected to a bunch of comic book writers for some reason. I can't even explain why. But there's this method where they'll have and you see this in film too. So I did work in film and TV, so maybe this is where I got it really. But you'll have like an A, B, C, D story throughout the book. In a series, they would do here's your A story. That's the primary story for that issue. And then there's B, C, D, etc. And then you have those kind of cutting in and out. You might even mention the D or E story as a minor cutaway in the story, in the book, in the issue. And then when you get to the end, you resolve the A story and you move on to the next issue. And then the B story becomes the A story and everything else shifts over. And I always did that anyway, but it's certainly something it's interesting because I'm doing that now. And this is where the improvisation is coming in, because as I've been writing according to the A and B stories that I outlined, a C story has occurred to me. And so I've started peppering that in. And as the book evolves, that C story is starting to kind of pick up momentum. And so it's almost like I'm writing a series within the book. The book it's kind of, I mean, it's probably only going to be around 100,000 words, but it's an epic story. And I think that this method is actually helping me make it feel like that. It's making it feel much more, it's feeling like it's at a much grander scale than it would for a typical archaeological thriller from Kevin Tumlinson. It's just, up a few notches because it's got these little threads woven through it.
Yeah.
Then I'm starting to pay off. I mean, I'm starting to pay off that C story is starting to kind of evolve now. And I'm actually well past the 95,000 word mark on this book. So, I've looped back. I think you and I on previous episodes of your show, I think, have discussed my looping method that I stole from.
Just refresh our memories about that.
Well, I completely stole this from Dean Wesley Smith and his book, Writing into the Dark. And I've met him a few times now, and I've thanked him profusely for this. So I use it with permission. He does something called cycling, where he'll write for like 500 words and he'll cycle back, edit those words, and then continue going. I use what I call looping because I'll write my day's word count. And then the next day I read through, edit, rewrite. And then when I reach the point where I stopped, I've got the momentum to keep going. But I also will loop back, especially if I hit like a rough patch, like the muddy middle, or anytime I'm feeling my momentum slowing down, I know that there's groundwork I may have neglected. So I'll loop back and rewrite from the beginning. And it's usually pretty light, but that it ends up adding to the word count as I go. And I can resolve problems. I could take this scene out. I can add this scene in. I can add this character early on. I can do all kinds of things because of that process. And then by the time I get back to the part where I stopped, I've again got that momentum. The story has evolved and I can continue on from where it is. And so it opens a lot of doors for me, but it helps me achieve that word count a lot faster than I think I would if I just tried to write the draft all the way through.
Yeah. Well, I also think it sort of helps you go where your energy is, because I'm definitely someone who I could have my 20,000 words of framing, but I'm very, very excited about a scene that takes place at what will be the 70,000 word mark. And I'm just going to go write it because if that's where my energy is, I don't feel like having to work through a bunch of other scenes to get to that and figure like, no, if my energy's there, I'm going to write it and I have to change it later because of something else that happens. I'm going to do that.
Yeah. I always told people I was a nonlinear writer, but I think the truth is I think that is true, but it's sort of it's nonlinear in the way that a time traveler would be nonlinear. Like I write my story beginning to end, but I use the magic of time travel to kind of go back and start at a different point and make different choices than I would have. So it is non-linear in that sense, but it's very linear in process. So I don't jump ahead and write the scene I really want to write. I make myself get there and I get the instinct. I get why you would want to go and write the one that's more interesting to you. But my philosophy on it, my theory on this is there's a reason why I'm bored with the part of the story I'm in. And that's a problem because if I'm bored, the reader's going to be bored. So that means that I have to go back and fix things as only time travelers can do. I'm the Sam Beckett, and this is my quantum leap. And I'm going to leap back and make right what once went wrong until I get back to the present. And I know what the future is going to look like more or less, but I have to earn it. I can't get to that fun scene that I know is coming until I've earned it by fixing what went wrong in the
The
book's
scene
path.
is like your carrot for
Yeah.
continuing on.
That's right. That's right. It's my reward.
Yeah.
Once I fix the book, fix all the things that...
Then you
'cause,
can have
I mean,
dessert.
Yeah, exactly. Because otherwise, you've got this disjointed scene that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the rest of the book because you jumped ahead. Who knows what could change? The other reason I do that is like, I may be really super excited about writing that scene, but the approach I take and the tack that I take, it's going to be different based entirely on the previous pages. If I write it based on what's there, then I'm just going to end up having to rewrite it. And all that fun and energy I had when I went into it is going to be wasted. And it may even become a drudgery for me to go back and write this scene that I loved. So I'd rather write it and get it all right from the start. I want to get to that moment, and I want it to be because it's perfect time for that moment. That's what I want.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna riff off your mention of drudgery, and I have two
Yes.
questions, and I'm not sure what order to ask them, and so I'm going to ask them both at the same time, and you can answer however you want. But you had said that you encountered this existential crisis, and that this was all kind of going on at the same time that you were trying to experiment with this outlining approach, I believe.
Yeah.
So my two questions are: did you dive into the outlining approach because you had to, because of the circumstances of your arrangement with JD, and were you then having to get around an existential crisis because it was so unfamiliar to you, or was that a chicken and egg thing? Like, which came first, the existential crisis, your need to outline?
It's a little bit of both, because the things that were going on in my life at that time, I got to a pretty low point, a pretty dark place, really. And I've talked about this pretty openly on my show and elsewhere, so I'm not spilling any tea or anything here, but I kind of, as maybe a lot of your listeners know, like I was with Draft Digital. I was the face of Draft Digital for about 7 years and loved the company and still do, and really wanted to see them succeed. So I had kind of, around 2020, we made some decisions, and I kind of put my writing career more or less on hold while I did things to help the writing community through D2D and to help Draft Digital. Because we were doing a lot of podcasts and stuff. We were doing this like daily live show. Kara and I were on the road full time. So it meant I had my work. Everyone else talked about how they suddenly had all this free time to write books and do things. And I had my workload quadrupled during that time. And so I was trying to keep up the books, keep up the podcasting, keep up all the other work, going to conferences, doing all these things that I felt like I owed everybody. And I just burnt out. And so I got into a pretty low point, and I got to a point where I was not writing as much anymore. And I was still writing every day, but I wasn't producing anymore. There was a long stretch where I went from putting out a book every 15 days at one point to no books for like a year, almost year and a half one time. And that was unacceptable to me. But so I had to come back, and I was having trouble with it because I was having anxiety and I was having dread. I just couldn't seem to overcome it. And so I needed to take a new approach. And I started kind of tinkering with the idea of outlining because at least it felt creative. It felt like something I could do. Maybe it would jar things loose or whatever. I had connected with JD during that time, and I got invited to be a co-host on Writers Inc. That opportunity kind of came up. So when he offered to let me co-author with him and he wanted an outline, I dove in, but I don't know why. It was just, for some reason, it just overwhelmed me. This idea of having to create an outline rather than simply writing the book. I started to get a little stressed about it. And I just got to a point where I gave him the outline, and that was in progress at that point. And he came back with some feedback, and I melted down. Not because it was unfair, not because he was rude or anything like that. It was just simply that it was going to require me to change this thing that I'd already been pulling really hard to get out of my soul in the first place. And so I ended up kind of just abandoning it. And he asked me months later, like, so are we ever going to get back to this? You ever going to do this? And I'm like, yeah, we will, man. I'm sorry. And it made me feel very low. And it made me feel like maybe my career in this was over. And then he heard I restarted the Wordslinger podcast around that period with the intention, by the way, I had never given it its final season. And I had put it on hiatus in 2020 as one of the things that got dropped while I concentrated on the author community and on draft digital stuff. And so I secretly was going to give it its last season. And so I was just inviting in people that I'd already had on the show, people I liked. And then in the final 3 episodes, I would announce that, well, this is going to be the last season and they got 3 episodes left or whatever. And then amazingly, I ended up falling back in love with that show. And so I'm still going strong in the Wordslinger podcast again. But he had heard the episode I did with Ernest Dempsey about archaeological thrillers. And he came to me with that idea and I liked it. I thought it had some potential. And so I said, look, I'll do it. But this time we're going to do things a little different. I'm not going to give you the outline until it's completely done. You can give me all the feedback you want after that, and I will take it and rewrite it, whatever. But I need to it's really sort of the same existential problem writers face all the time, especially when they're just starting out. And it's, you gain the most momentum when you finally actually finish something. When I started writing, I have my collection still of what I call my thirds in there, the first third of a book. I would start and abandon. I did that for years. But until I actually sat and wrote my first book, wrote from beginning to end a full manuscript, one that was not great, by the way, and has never seen print. But until I did that, I didn't have that voice in me to remind me that I could do it. So all I had was the voice saying, yeah, but you never have. You've never done it. You've started and you've talked a big game, but you never finished it. And the same was true for the outline. I needed to finish an outline before I could hand it over to get feedback. And so that's how that went. He agreed. I wrote that outline, rewrote that outline when it fell apart, because there was a point at which it fell apart. I've never heard of anyone reaching a muddy middle for an outline before, but I did. But once I completely scrapped the original concept that I had, completely threw it out the window and started over at one point. And once I had that, cleaned it up and handed it to him, I held my breath for a while, but I was ready. I mean, I was legitimately ready to get whatever feedback he was going to give me, and I was going to knuckle down and do it. And oddly, he didn't have any. So I think I was probably overthinking things. Probably that's what I tend to do. But that moment was enough to give me what I needed from the experience, which was that little voice that would remind me, you have done this. You've done it before. You can do it again. You had a good experience. Everything's fine. And once I had that, I'm not going to say that it's gotten entirely easy. I have my moments when there's still a little touch of anxiety about things, but I've made tremendous progress in this book, despite occasionally feeling that little moment of dread, that little moment of anxiety. And I think it's not because I wrote the outline, but it's because I wrote the outline. It's not because of the outline. It's because I got myself, I figured out a way to get myself to actually produce the outline. The outline itself didn't matter as much as just completing it.
Yeah.
Which I think is good advice. I think comes back to good advice for all writers. It's like, doesn't matter whether the thing you wrote is Nobel worthy or Pulitzer worthy or whatever. It's more important that you finish it so that you can remind yourself going forward that you can do this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I also think that idea that I suspect that a lot of people get stuck with a third or a half or 3/4 of a book or whatever because they feel like it's going off the rails in some way. They're not getting on the page, what they see in their head and all sorts of reasons like that. And that idea that just finish it and then step back and decide what you want to do with it rather than stopping yourself partway through.
Yeah.
You don't have to publish the first book you write, and it's probably a good idea not to. And maybe people shouldn't have that as their goal for their first book. Maybe their goal for their first book should be to finish it.
Yeah, and I know that's going to hurt some folks to even think about.
Yeah.
But keep this in mind, like you can still come back and fix that later. We give artists, we give people who draw or paint, we give them a huge pass on early work, right? Again, somehow I'm connected to a whole bunch of comic book artists. I see this all the time, but there's one guy in particular who decided, like, because now he's a big name comic book artist, but he went back and was looking at like his earliest drawings from like starting all the way back when he was a kid, when he was in high school, even his first year or so in college or whatever. Like you could see he had some talent, but it was nowhere near as refined as what he has now. But so he took a bunch of his early drawings, even stuff from when he was a kid, almost stick figure level stuff, and redrew them with his current talent. Same themes, same shape, general shapes and everything. Just updated it with his ability now. And I think that's what we should do as writers. Look at all that early stuff you did, and it's the stuff that makes you cringe. Like I said, I keep saying, well, that book has never seen print. Well, why hasn't it? Why haven't I gone back, taken that book, knowing what I know now, and fixing it line for line? There's nothing sacred about that early draft. That's exactly what is a draft. That first book that I wrote is essentially the same level of skill that I apply on the first draft of every book I write. No book I write comes out letter perfect. So if I can fix those, and the only difference is that I fix those as I go, more or less, with my looping process. But there's absolutely nothing that says I couldn't sit down, open up that book, and rewrite it, knowing everything I know now, having the skill I have now, and refine it and make it something worth releasing. There's nothing that says that. So maybe I need to follow my advice and do that.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you when you started that question, what is the reason? If you're saying there's no reason, then maybe I'll need to invite you back in a couple of months or a year, a couple of years, and see how it's going.
I should do it. I should do it because the reality of it is that it's just that there is a bit of a sense that it is sacred in its way because it's this early draft, but I can make a copy of it. I don't have to overwrite it.
Yeah.
I have actually have it printed out in a spiral here in my office. It's got some red line notes and stuff. I never did get it fully edited, but there's nothing that says I couldn't just take that and start over and start a new version of it or whatever, or just take the concept and scrap it and rewrite it. There's nothing that says I can't do that. There's nothing sacred about that manuscript, and it'll always be there in one form or another. I think it's probably a good idea for authors to look at that early work like that and think about how would you tell that story now based on everything you've learned in the meantime. I don't know how many authors Matty, do you have like early manuscripts that have never seen print?
No, I don't. I kept working on it until I felt like it was ready to go, but I haven't returned to it because, well, two reasons. One is that my first book has a lot of really positive reviews, and I'm like, well, that's good. There's no business incentive for me to go back and do an overhaul, but I also, I just don't really want to, want to revisit it. And the example that I use when this comes up is I remember running into somebody at a conference, and he found out I had a podcast. And at that time I had like 200 and some episodes. And he said, I'm going to go back and start at episode 1 and listen to them all. And I was like, you know what? Don't do that.
Yeah,
start now and then work your way back until you're bored, because the first ones aren't as good as the later ones are. What a surprise.
I will say my first episodes of Wordslinger podcast are not dramatically different. I remember being on another podcast a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now. And by that time, the show had been around. I'd been on the air for like 6 years or 7 years or something. And one of the hosts says, you still have the same theme song and everything. Like, you haven't changed much about the show at all. I'm like, I've got a winning formula. Why change it? So
yeah, absolutely.
I need to go back and listen to that first. My first episode is called Hello World, which is what you call the first thing you do publicly. That's a reference to coding. But yeah, I need to go back and listen to it and see how it holds up. I have a style. I mean, but I also worked in radio and stuff for a while, or radio and TV and everything. So I have patter. I do things a certain way, and I've learned that as a kind of system. So it's not dramatically different.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to use that as a jumping off spot for the last question I wanted to ask you, which is this is something that came out of, I was listening to a recent episode that you did with Joe Solari on the State of the Nation, Author Nation podcast. And you were talking in general about the outlining thing. And you mentioned that one has to humble oneself to learn. Do you remember that comment that you made to Joe? Can you just talk a little bit about the background of you saying that?
Yeah, because my first instinct over the years, whenever I've talked to anyone about the idea of one, outlining, but two, co-authoring, anything involved in that process, there's a bit of arrogance in there built in that I know what I'm doing. I've done this forever. What advice could you possibly give me? And I don't know, I wasn't a jerk about it, but I don't like people to give me feedback on my work, on my writing in particular. But in this process, I had to do things JD's way because this is his book. This is his project. And so I can insist a little bit on my take, my style, my idea, whatever. But ultimately, he gets to turn it all down if he doesn't like the result. So this process has been about me, humbling myself so that I can learn a new approach to this business, something a little different. I don't know everything. I haven't had every experience that you can have as a writer. And if I'm going to grow, not just as a writer, but as a human being, I need to be willing to kind of let my ego take a back seat, maybe even get in the trunk, and just allow the process. Because what's the worst that's going to happen to me in this? JD comes back, hates everything I wrote, got to rewrite the book. I got to slog through it. I've had worse experiences than that, but the upside, the thing that could happen and that I'm kind of counting on happening is I think this is going to be an excellent book with my name on it and his name on it. And I think he's got resources that I don't necessarily have access to. Like he's got this deal with Simon & Schuster for distribution. He's got people, film agents and things that have already started pushing this thing out as a concept alone and gotten interest in it. So there's an access here that I wouldn't normally have. And the price of me potentially having this thing with my name on it that could increase my discoverability with new readers, maybe accelerate my writing career, the price is for me to humble myself enough to be a student at a time in my life where I sometimes think I'm the master. I think it's good for all of us to get into that track every now and then. Because certainly if I had gotten that deal with James Patterson back in the day, and we're talking like 2016, so this was a long time ago, I don't think I would have been ready for it. I don't think I would have succeeded because I would have been kind of arrogant about my approach, my process. I remember taking his masterclass and thinking, why would you do that? But now what I'm doing is trying to upgrade myself, and you can't upgrade yourself if you've convinced yourself that you already know everything or that you already have this skill mastered. The greatest artists of any age continuously learned while they went. They continuously humbled themselves. Da Vinci, Leonardo himself, was learning until the day he died. He was constantly asking questions and approaching life like with a beginner's mind, like a student. And it's hard to argue that there was a greater master. Michelangelo maybe, but Da Vinci had a broader range and a deeper range of passions and experiences. I want to be a Da Vinci. I'm impressed right now with Dan Brown. He's my new obsession. He launched the genre that I write in practically. It's been around forever in one name or another. There's like spy novels and things like that. But the whole archaeological thriller, adventure novel, he popularized that. I wouldn't necessarily even have my current career if he hadn't. But I'm looking at this guy, I'm like, he put out a book 7 years ago. It was the last time he put out a book. 7 years ago. And he's releasing a new one. It's already pre-selling in the millions. I want that career. So forget what I know. Forget everything I know. I want to study at the feet of Dan Brown. how do I get there? First, you don't go straight to the top of the mountain and study with the guru. You have to get through all the levels on the way up the mountain. And JD is one of those levels. I got a certain height, a certain way up on my own, doing things my way. And now if I want to grow and evolve, I need to humble myself and be a learner, be a student.
Well, Kevin, I appreciate you so much sharing both the business side of your decisions about outlining and way beyond outlining, but also sort of behind the scenes, pulling back the curtain a little bit and letting us know what some of the other considerations were. Love that story. And thank you for sharing it.
Absolutely.
And please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
You can go to kevintumlinson.com. That's my website. And there you'll find a link to actually what I am putting most of my focus and energy on these days, the new gateway, which is my Substack, which is, you can find a link to it there, but you can go straight to it at kevintumlinson.substack.com. And that's called the writer _ just so you're...
just to loop back so people
just so
remember.
You know, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Kevin. What strategies do you use to overcome writer's block or anxiety when working on a big project? I would love to hear about it. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.